I still remember the way that paper felt between my fingers, soft, fragile, almost translucent from time and touch. It smelled faintly of lavender and dust, like something that had been waiting patiently in a drawer for far too long. That letter, her last letter, had been sealed for over 40 years, and I had never dared to open it. It was tucked away in a wooden box I kept in the attic of my home in Vermont, the same box where I stored the pieces of my youth I never had the courage to throw out. Dog tags, faded photographs, old medals no one ever asked about, and the stack of letters she wrote to me while I was overseas. Her name was Evelyn. She wrote to me almost every week during the war, her handwriting elegant, with long flowing loops that made even the darkest lines feel like poetry. I read those letters under the dim light of lanterns, behind sandbags, in the cold mud of France, sometimes with trembling hands. They were the only thing that reminded me what I was fighting for, what I was living for. But this one, the one I left unopened all these years, was different. I don't know why I never read it. Maybe I was afraid that it would say something I couldn't bear to hear, that it would close the only part of my past I still held on to. Or maybe, deep down, I already knew what it would say. I found it again yesterday. My grandson had been asking about the war, about whether I ever loved someone back then. Funny, isn't it? After all these years, that question still stopped me cold. I told him I did. But what I didn't tell him, what I haven't told anyone, is that the woman I loved wrote to me until the very end of the war, and that her final letter was a goodbye, not because she stopped loving me, but because the war made sure I would never get back to her in time. This is not a story about battles or victories. It's about the kind of love that writes through silence, waits through absence, and still lets go when it has to. If you've ever loved someone across time, across distance, if you've ever lost someone without a final goodbye, then maybe this story will speak to you the way it's spoken to me, quietly, for decades. If this story is touching your heart the way it touched mine as I wrote it, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. It started on the edge of summer in 1942, just outside a small town in upstate New York. Evelyn lived on the other side of the tracks, not the kind of metaphor people like to use when talking about class or upbringing, just the literal truth. Her family owned a modest dairy farm. Mine ran a general store near the post office. We'd seen each other in passing for years, at Sunday services, local dances, school fundraisers, but we never really spoke. Not until that afternoon behind the church, when I helped her carry a crate of peaches to her mother's truck. She said thank you, softly, like she wasn't used to being noticed. I just nodded. I didn't have the words back then. I wasn't sure I even knew what to say. But something started that day. Maybe not love, not yet, just something quiet and warm, the kind of feeling that settles in your chest and stays there. For weeks after that, we kept finding excuses to run into each other. At the bakery, outside the hardware store, walking down the same dirt road after sunset, pretending like we just happened to be heading the same way. We talked in small bursts, about books, music, things we missed from before the war started casting its long shadow over everything. One evening, just as the fireflies were starting to glow, she handed me a folded piece of paper. She didn't say anything, just slipped it into my hand and walked away. I stood there, unsure whether to open it. My fingers trembled, my heart raced, and when I finally unfolded it, the words inside were written in her delicate, looping handwriting. If you ever leave, write to me, please. I kept that note in my wallet for years. Back then, the draft was a constant whisper in every young man's ear. The older boys were already gone. The ones who'd stayed behind knew it was only a matter of time. When my number came up, I wasn't surprised. But I didn't know how to tell her, so I waited. We sat together on the porch swing behind her family's barn the night before I left. The air smelled like hay and lilacs. She wore her hair down. She didn't cry. She didn't beg me to stay. She just reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small handkerchief embroidered with her initials in the corner. "Keep this with you," she said, "for luck." I wanted to kiss her. I didn't. I didn't know how. Instead, I said something stupid like, "I'll write as soon as I can." She just nodded and looked at me like she already knew what was coming. The train to basic training was crowded, loud, full of kids trying not to look scared. I held onto that handkerchief the entire ride, folded it neatly and kept it in my chest pocket, where it stayed through every step after. The barracks, the boat across the Atlantic, the first time I heard artillery shake the ground beneath my feet. And then came her first letter. It was postmarked from home, written on simple lined paper. The envelope smelled like lavender, her perfume. I opened it under the moonlight, near the French countryside, while my boots were still wet with mud and my hands still shaking from the day's march. She didn't write anything dramatic. She told me about the chickens, how they'd stopped laying eggs, about her younger brother who'd finally learned to ride a bike, about how the bakery had closed early one day because the power went out. But at the end of that letter, she wrote, "Every evening I sit on the porch and look at the trees. I wonder if you're looking at the same sky. I hope you are." That letter, it carried me through the first winter in Europe. I wrote back the next day. I didn't tell her everything, not about the fear, not about what I'd seen, but I told her about the sky, about how the stars looked different here, about how I carried her handkerchief every day, about how I thought of her more than she probably knew. And so it began, this rhythm of letters, soft and steady like a heartbeat. She became my anchor, my warmth, my proof that something real waited on the other side of all this. We never said "I love you" in those early letters. We didn't have to. The war didn't end in a single moment, not for me. It stretched endlessly, across days soaked in mud and nights interrupted by mortar fire, across names I forgot and sounds I'll never unhear. It became routine almost, the way you learn to sleep light, the way you keep one boot on even in your bunk, the way silence can be more terrifying than bullets. The world narrowed to minutes, and each letter from Evelyn felt like a doorway to something human again. Her handwriting never changed, not once. Even as the months passed and the world kept crumbling, she wrote in the same careful, steady strokes, and her envelope still carried that faint scent of lavender. I don't know how she managed to make every one of those letters feel like a hand on my shoulder. She never wrote about the war, not really. Her words were soft escapes, about her father planting tomatoes too early, about a neighbor's dog that wouldn't stop howling at the train, about the way she watched snow fall through the window and thought of me. And I clung to those details like a soldier clings to the last dry match in his pocket, because that's what they were: fire, warmth, hope. But then something changed. It didn't happen all at once. That's what made it harder. It started small. One letter came late, then the next was shorter, then came one that didn't smell like lavender at all. The rhythm broke. I read that letter in a church-turned-shelter outside Bastogne. She wrote only a few lines, no mention of her family, no talk of the porch swing. Just a single paragraph, and her name at the bottom wasn't signed with the usual flourish. Just an E. It unsettled me more than the bombing that night. I wrote back immediately, tried not to sound desperate, told her I was safe, that I thought about her constantly, that I missed the way she used to describe the sunlight on the barn roof. I even drew a little sketch of the two of us walking through the woods, just like we used to. But the next letter didn't come. Not that week, not the next. I waited. I watched the mailbags come in like a child waiting for Christmas, hands shaking, stomach tight, only to walk away empty every time. I started to imagine reasons. Maybe she was sick. Maybe the roads were snowed in. Maybe her parents had moved, maybe her letters were lost in transit, but deep down, I knew what silence felt like. And this was that. I asked around. Some of the other boys had their mail intercepted or blacked out. We started hearing about censorship, how the army or the post office would read everything, cutting out inappropriate content, burning letters entirely if they were flagged. Some guys had gone months without a word from home, only to find out their families had written dozens of times. I started to wonder if Evelyn had written, and her words just never made it through. Or worse, if something she wrote had made someone decide I didn't deserve to read it. I rewrote my next letter 6 times before I sent it. I kept it vague. I didn't mention where I was, what I'd seen, or how cold it had gotten. I just told her I still carried her handkerchief in my pocket, that I still slept with it folded under my shirt, right over my heart, that when the sky was clear at night, I'd look up and hope she was looking at it too. Still, no reply. Then came the day I was hit. It was near the end of winter. We were advancing through a small village outside Metz when something exploded just behind us. I don't remember the sound, just the flash, then the cold. The ground came up fast, and I didn't feel the blood until I saw it soaking through the thigh of my pants. They said I was lucky it missed the artery. I didn't feel lucky. I spent 3 weeks in a field hospital. The ceiling leaked. The morphine was weak. And all I could think about was her, that she hadn't heard from me, that maybe she thought I'd died, that maybe she'd already started grieving. I wrote her the longest letter of my life. I told her everything. Not about the pain, but about my dreams, about what I wanted to build when I came home. A little house, a garden, a porch swing for 2. I told her I wanted to read to her at night, to learn to cook her favorite pie, to listen to music on the radio without worrying about sirens. I told her I loved her. I never got a reply. The war ended the way a storm passes, slowly, without warning, leaving behind a landscape you barely recognize. By the time I boarded the transport ship back to the States, I wasn't the young man who had left. I was quieter, older, though not by age. My body was whole, more or less, but something deeper had shifted, like a door that had closed inside me and refused to open again. We docked in New Jersey in the spring of '45. There were cheers on the pier, flags, brass bands playing swing. I smiled for the photos, shook hands, waved to strangers, but I felt like a visitor in someone else's dream. All I wanted was to get home. I took the train upstate, to the town where I'd been born, where Evelyn had lived. The station looked the same. Peeling paint, rusted tracks, the old soda machine leaning at an angle. But the silence between people was different. The war had changed everyone. When I walked into the corner store, the man behind the counter blinked twice before he recognized me. "We thought you were gone," he said. "Forever." So had I. The walk to my house was quiet. The streets were narrower than I remembered, the trees taller. The porch steps creaked the same way they always had. But the screen door was off its hinges. The garden had turned wild. I opened the door and stepped inside, and it was like stepping into someone else's life. The air smelled like dust and old wood. I could still see the indent in the kitchen table where my father used to tap his spoon when he read the newspaper. But no one had lived here in months, maybe longer. There was a letter from the county pinned to the wall saying the house was pending reassessment, whatever that meant. I asked around about Evelyn. At first, people hesitated. Some said she'd moved to Boston with family. Others said they hadn't seen her since 1944. One woman whispered that Evelyn's father had died during a fuel shortage that winter, and after that she just disappeared. Disappeared. That word sat in my chest like a stone. I walked the streets we used to take together, past the old church, the field where she once picked wildflowers, the bench where we first held hands. I stood in front of her family's house. It was boarded up, windows broken, no lights, no mailbox, no sign. It felt like a whole part of my life had been erased. I spent the next few days trying to adjust, sorting through the dust in my childhood home, opening old trunks, folding uniforms I no longer wanted to look at. And then, one afternoon, I found something. In the back of my father's desk drawer, beneath a stack of faded bills and ration cards, was a small, sealed envelope. My name was written on the front. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Evelyn's. I stood there for a long time staring at it. I turned it over in my hands, ran my fingers along the edges. It hadn't been opened. It hadn't even been mailed. There was no stamp, just my name. Folded and waiting. I sat down in the corner chair, the one my mother used to knit in, and I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She had written it by lamplight. I could tell from the way the letters curled, tired, slanted slightly, like her hand had trembled. The letter wasn't long, but it hit like a bullet. She wrote that she had waited, that she had written again and again, that the silence from my end had become unbearable. She said she didn't know if I was alive, if I had chosen not to answer, if I had simply vanished into the war like so many others. And she wrote something else, something I've never forgotten. I don't want to stop loving you, but I need to start living again. She signed it only with her name. No date, return address, no explanation of where she was going. I read it again, then a fourth time. The walls of the house seemed to grow smaller with every word. I hadn't known. God knows I would have written if I could. I had. I thought I had. But the war, the distance, the censorship, the chaos had swallowed it all. My words hadn't reached her. Hers, perhaps, had never reached me. All that was left was this. One letter, one goodbye. It was the most painful thing I had ever read, and still it was the most honest gift she could have given me. Her truth, her grief, her need to move forward. I folded the letter back into the envelope, sealed it with my hand, and placed it in the top drawer of the nightstand, next to the handkerchief she gave me the night before I left. I didn't cry that night, I didn't move. I just sat there, finally understanding what silence meant. Time doesn't heal the way people think it does. It doesn't erase anything. It just softens the edges like water against stone. You still remember the sharpness. You just learn how to walk around it. The pain becomes a room in your house. You don't live in it anymore, but you pass by it every day. I never saw Evelyn again. I never found out where she went, whether she married, whether she had children, whether she grew old with someone else who wrote her letters she could actually read. I don't know if she stayed in Massachusetts or left it behind altogether. I only know that she lived without me. And in some quiet, difficult way, I learned to live without her too. But I never stopped loving her. That love just changed shape. It moved from my hands into my bones, from my thoughts into my silence, from the life we could have shared into the stories I never told. I rebuilt the house. I repaired the porch swing. I planted a new garden where the weeds had taken over because she once told me she liked the way lavender smelled at dusk. And I kept the drawer where her letter rested untouched, except for once a year, on the same day I first opened it. I would take it out, unfold the paper, read it again, slowly, carefully. Like prayer, I never married. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to. How do you love someone else when you already gave everything you had to someone who's no longer there? I lived a quiet life, took a job at the post office, fished on weekends, learned how to fix old radios. Sometimes I sat on that porch swing at night and imagined her beside me, not a ghost, not a dream, but just the version of her that time would have shaped, wrinkles where her smile lived, silver in her hair, that same soft laugh when she teased me about burning the toast. I don't think she stopped loving me either. I think she just ran out of time to wait, and how could I blame her? She gave me everything she had, her words, her hope, her goodbye, and in return, I gave her silence, not because I chose it, but because war doesn't ask what you want to keep, it just takes. I never became anyone famous. There's no plaque with my name on it, no grandchildren named after me, but every so often, someone asks if I ever fell in love. And I always say yes, with a girl who wrote me letters during the worst days of my life, who believed in me before I believed in myself, who taught me that even in silence love can speak loudly, and that even a goodbye can be the beginning of something that stays. She isn't in any of the photos, you won't find her name in the papers, but she's in the way I fold my shirts, in the way I carry my coffee to the porch, in the way I still glance toward the mailbox, even though I know there's nothing coming. She's in the way I remember, and remembering, I've come to realize, is its own kind of love. I used to think love was something loud, something you declared under a street lamp or screamed over the sound of a departing train. But now I know better. Love is quiet. Love is the space someone leaves behind that you still keep tidy. It's the seat beside you that you never let anyone else take. It's the name you whisper when no one's listening. It's a folded piece of paper in a drawer that you'll never throw away. Evelyn never came back, and I stopped searching long ago, not because I gave up, but because some stories don't have final chapters. They just fade into memory, into habits, into the way your hand hesitates before reaching for a letter that will never arrive. There are moments now when I think about what might have been, not often, not to torture myself, just quietly. Would we have built that porch together? Would we have argued over what flowers to plant? Would she have fallen asleep with her head on my shoulder while I read the paper? Would she have kept writing me letters even if we were in the same room? I like to think she would have, but more than that, I like to think she loved me enough to stop writing when it hurt too much. That her goodbye wasn't a failure. It was an act of courage, of grace, of choosing life when everything else had stopped. There are many things the war took from me. Years, people, silence I didn't ask for. But it gave me something too. It gave me her words, and they are still here, tucked inside the top drawer, etched into the rhythm of my daily life. Echoing in the quiet moments when the world forgets to be loud. If you've ever waited for someone who never came, if you've ever held onto a memory tighter than a person, if you've ever loved with all you had and had to let go anyway, then you understand. Then you've been here too. And maybe, just maybe, stories like this one remind us that even the quietest loves leave the loudest echoes. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine as I lived and wrote it, please like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling the kinds of stories that move, inspire, and stay with you long after they end. We share new videos every day. Real stories, honest memories, love that lingers.